This week, we're going to be doing a very fun painting. We're going to be copying one of the most famous paintings of all time. This is The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. But before we begin, if you're unfamiliar with this painting, let's take a trip into Midtown Manhattan to go visit it. I'm standing here on the corner of 5th Avenue and 53rd Street. And right down the block on 53rd between 5th and 6th Avenue is one of my favorite hometown museums, MoMA, or the Museum of Modern Art. Now, I personally love this place. I've been here countless times during my life, and there's always something new to see with each visit. It's an absolutely incredible art museum and a must visit if you're ever in New York. Now, honestly, I could talk about MoMA all day long because some of the most important works created over the last 150 years hang within its galleries. From the late 19th century to contemporary works, the Museum of Modern Art's collection is outstanding and it's extensive. But we're here to see one painting, that of course is The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. It's just one of those paintings that always has a small crowd around it, and for good reason. The Starry Night was painted by Vincent in June of 1889. It's an oil painting on canvas depicting a scene from his room while he was being cared for at an asylum in southern France. Vincent van Gogh was an artist as talented as some and more sensitive than most, and during his pretty short career, he was able to achieve the most important and fabled job of any great artist, and that is to remind the viewer of what life is and what life is about, rather than simply offering a relief or an escape from it. Van Gogh's Starry Night is not only an incredible aesthetic achievement and a beautiful painting, but it's a work that embraced early modernism and impressionism in painting, not only through observation, but through invention and expression. The emotion within this painting is one of the things that makes it so special, especially for a landscape. For example, the immediacy and fluidity of that impasto brushwork, where the paint is laid on so heavily that it almost has like a sculptural look to it. And that stylized rendering and glow of the moon, the stars, and Venus, which are all set above a small French village, which has a large cypress tree growing out of it that almost looks like a flame. One thing that I mentioned on this channel a few times was Vincent's love of Japanese art. He was a huge collector of Japanese prints, many of which influenced his later work. Two of the most important Japanese print artists were Hokusai and Hiroshige, both of which were brilliant artists in their own right and whose work influenced many Western artists from the late 19th century on. Vincent van Gogh even copied multiple prints by Hiroshige, rendering them in oils on canvas. Now, this is just a surmise and my interpretation, but it's hard not to see a resemblance in between Hokusai's Great Wave and Hiroshige's Whirlpool with Van Gogh's Starry Night. Now, there's no direct evidence that Vincent used these as inspiration. There's nothing in his letters or writings, but it seems to me that these works may have been on his mind. Another possible inspiration that is commonly suggested is William Parsons' drawing Whirlpool Galaxy, which he observed through a 72-inch reflecting telescope in 1845. Regardless of where Vincent drew inspiration, The Starry Night is an entirely original painting, one of those rare works that's going to live on forever. And now, before I finish up this intro, an interesting note is that it doesn't seem that Vincent was very happy with this painting. Within his many, many letters, and I actually read through all of these back in 2006, there's very little written by Vincent about The Starry Night, and it seems to be mentioned by him only a handful of times. In a letter to another artist and Vincent's friend Bernard in November of 1889, which was about 5 months after Starry Night was painted, Vincent wrote that, and I quote, "However, once again, I let myself go by making the stars too big. Another failure, and I've had enough." That's a loose translation, but as accurate as I can get it, and it seems here that he was referring to Starry Night within that letter. And it's such a shame that he may have felt this way about this work and never went on to see the impact that it would have in the world and all of us over the next 130 years. And within a year, unfortunately, Vincent's condition grew worse, even beyond the reach of art, and he didn't make it out. But he left behind some of the most beautiful and important paintings ever created. And I personally love him for his courage and commitment to his art and will always, always be grateful for the wonderful gift that he left all of us. If you ever get a chance to see any of Vincent van Gogh's paintings in real life at a museum, I highly recommend it. And if you're ever in New York, the Museum of Modern Art is one of the places that you really have to spend some time at. So from here, let's move on to the actual painting. This is my first time copying Starry Night with an airbrush using subtractive technique, so go easy on me, but this is my completed painting. And the way that we're going to be painting this one is on a smooth canvas that I set up myself using transparent colors. The highlights are going to be achieved by removing paint, so very similar to drawing. And if you're new to painting or using an airbrush, I just want to point out that this technique is going to be very, very different from the one that Vincent van Gogh used in his painting. With the thin layers from an airbrush, we'll never be able to build up that thick impasto effect that Van Gogh was able to get with his oil paints. But we'll be focusing on the values to get this painting to look relatively close using these techniques. My painting here is 18 inches by 24 inches, and I set up a 1x1 grid on this canvas. Again, the technique here is going to be very different from what Vincent van Gogh used, but the point of a grid just allows me to get in all my lines accurately. And it's also going to help simplify the painting for me because I'll focus on small sections at a time, slowly getting to the final painting. I'm going to start on the upper left-hand side of the sky, and one of the first things that I want to start doing is try to add in the effect of brush strokes. One thing about an airbrush is since it atomizes and sprays paint, you're always going to get soft lines and soft transitions. So I need some sort of tool to help me out to make these lines sharper. What I'm using here is a freehand shield. This is one made by Art Tool. And what I'm doing is lining up this shield where I see some of those brush strokes and then just spraying on some paint. You can see that once I lift the shield up, I get a very sharp edge on one side and a softer edge on the other side. For this entire painting, I'm using Createx illustration colors. It's one of my favorite airbrush paints. And the color that I'm using right now is cobalt blue. I'm using this directly from the bottle. No reducer, no distilled water, and I'm spraying here at around 28-29 psi. The paint is a little thicker right out of the bottle, so a higher psi is just going to help atomize it a bit better. And so now for the highlights, the bright areas within this paint, I'm going to be using a negative or a subtractive technique. And what that means is it's like a drawing technique. I'm going to be using an eraser here to erase into this paint. And this is the opposite of traditional oil painting. In oil painting, if you want something lighter, you mix an opaque lighter color and add it over the top. But here for an airbrush painting, as I erase into the paint, it's just going to expose some of that white gesso underneath, giving you a lighter value of the color that's placed down. Once I have some of that paint erased out, I can go back to my airbrush with that cobalt blue and glaze on a thin layer of paint over the top. Besides the stick eraser, which I'll have links for down below, I'm also using a sand eraser. This type of eraser is used for erasing ink. It's very, very aggressive. And I'm using the sand eraser almost like a large paintbrush. It pulls out a lot of paint and it pulls it out pretty quickly. So I could just direct this in between those lines, scratch out some paint to pull out some highlights in there. And as I work my way along the grid, working from one square to the next, I'll just be using this technique. After I lay some paint down either freehand or with a shield, I'll use one of those erasers and just start erasing some paint out in between. And what you'll start seeing here is that combination of paint and scratch marks from the eraser will almost start to look like some brush strokes. While I was painting this, I was not in any way trying to copy every single brush stroke, because that kind of goes against the entire purpose of this style of painting. So if you're copying this one, maybe painting it on a smaller surface, maybe on a piece of paper, try not to be too concerned with making an exact replica of the original painting, where each brush stroke is a one-to-one match from the original Starry Night. But instead try to follow the idea that he was going for in his painting, a more fluid brushstroke that shows off a painterly effect, and a style that needs to be a lot looser in order to be effective. For my copy here, that's what I was trying to do. It's not perfect or exact by any stretch, but that's okay. Copying has a long tradition in the study of arts. It's about learning from the artists you admire, but more importantly, it's about spending time with their work and observing it. And I promise you that if you copy any painting that you love or admire, you're going to learn more about it, things that you've never noticed before in the past. So now as I work my way along to the right, I'm doing the same thing by spraying over the shield, and I'm trying to pay attention to the direction of the brush strokes. Vincent van Gogh almost painted this like it's water. There's a very fluid motion to the sky where the brush strokes just flow from one part to the next. So as I place down some paint with that shield, I always go back in with an eraser and pull out some highlights in between. This way the sky almost has a rippled effect where you're seeing light, dark, just a pattern across the entire surface. For the stars, you can see at this point I left them blank. I didn't apply any of that blue paint over the top. For the center of the star, I'm using some transparent yellow paint and I'm just spraying over a shield to help sharpen up the edges. Now, while I was painting these stars, I was very cautious in the beginning here because I didn't want any of the overspray from the yellow to get onto the blue. Because we all know what happens if yellow and blue mix, you're going to get the color green, and I was trying to avoid that in the stars. But if you pay attention to Vincent's Starry Night, you will notice that some of the stars actually do have a green color to them. When he was adding the blues and the yellows, they clearly mixed in some areas, so you're going to have a slightly greenish hue around the outside of some of the stars. So I allowed myself to loosen up and not be all that concerned if I get some green in there, because if Vincent did it, I think I'll be alright. For some of the brush strokes, which creates that glow around each star, I'm using a shield here. This is a circle template. And I went back to the color cobalt blue here, and you can see that I'm just spraying over the edge of some different size circles. And I'm not spraying continually so I get a full circle. I'm just spraying small parts of the shield so it looks like there's some gaps, making it look like brush strokes. Once I work my way around that entire star, I'll go right back over to the eraser and pull out some paint in between. Then I can go back to that transparent cobalt blue and spray it over the top, just a thin glaze, trying to avoid it within the center so the center of the star doesn't turn green. But that'll help darken up this area and allow me to erase into it further. And this is one of the things that I love about using transparent paints with an airbrush, because you can build up a lot of texture. Since the color is transparent, I'm not going to lose any of that texture, those eraser marks, or the scratches within the paint that I was able to get with those erasers. A glaze of a transparent color like this cobalt blue over the top is just going to darken up the value, but you'll still be able to see the textures and the highlights underneath. And you'll notice here that the value of my copy is much lighter than in the original painting. And I'm doing that on purpose because if I need to make this darker later on, it's so easy to do. I could just take some of that cobalt blue and glaze it over the top to darken everything up. Again, that's a very nice thing about using an airbrush, specifically with transparent colors. It's so incredibly easy to make something darker if you need to. I'll move along to the right side, same thing, using a shield, making sure I leave some gaps where the stars are going to be. And you can see that I'm using this large sand eraser here, and it does such an amazing job at pulling out some paint and giving you kind of a random texture, almost like a large paintbrush. I'll also use it in a few areas around the stars, just pulling out a few of those thin, bright highlights. To the right side of these stars, Van Gogh's brush strokes start to curve up. It's almost like a concave shape. So I'm just working in one square here, lining up my freehand shield with my initial drawing and then spraying over it. You can see that I'm not spraying across the whole shield, just a few areas to make it look like sporadic brush strokes within this area. After I started going further into the painting, I realized that I didn't really need to use that shield. Instead, what I started doing, and you'll see me doing it here, is just spraying down some dark lines with the airbrush, and then using that eraser to erase in between them. That'll sharpen up the edges, and it'll also give that highlight. And to darken up a few of the lines later on in this painting, I will be using a mixture of cobalt blue with some Payne's gray. The Payne's gray will just help to desaturate it and darken up the value, but we'll talk about that later on. Now from here, let's move along to one of the most important parts, almost like the centerpiece of the painting, the large swirl that goes across it. You can see in Van Gogh's Starry Night that this swirl that goes across the center of the sky is still a blue, but it's a lighter version. It's a paler blue than the darker one just above it. And because I'm using transparent paints, meaning that there's no white added to this mixture, I'm just going to spray less of this color. If you are only using transparent colors like I'm doing here, if you want a lighter value of that color, all you need to do is spray less of it. And that's only going to work on a white surface like a piece of paper or a gessoed canvas. And the reason for that is very simple. It's just because some more of the white is showing through, so it's going to make that color, that blue here, look brighter. And you can see that's what's going on here with this swirl. I'm just spraying less paint so the area is looking lighter. And I'm also being a little bit more aggressive with that eraser, trying to pull out more paint with it. And what I mean by that is I'm just using more pressure on the eraser. I'm pressing harder into it, into the canvas, so more paint gets scratched out. As I continue painting the swirl, you can see the effect starting to come together. It's not an exact replica of the Starry Night by any stretch, but we're getting the impression of it. It's almost starting to look like brush strokes. And so for my copy of this painting, I didn't find it difficult to do, but I found it very time consuming. And what I mean by that is that there's just so much brush work in Vincent's original painting. There's just tons of small brush strokes flowing across this whole canvas. There's emotion within this painting that, to be honest, is kind of difficult to capture using such thin paints as an airbrush. And there were so many times during this painting that I wanted to just take out my palette and my oil paints and start adding it on top. But I set a goal for myself that I just want to do this one using subtractive techniques, only using an airbrush and erasers. And so that's what I did for this one. But if you're interested in adding some thicker paint on top, with a traditional brush, go for it. You could definitely build some more depth adding some thicker paint so you can get that 3D effect that Van Gogh got in his. And yes, you can absolutely apply oil paint with a traditional brush over acrylic paint, like one applied with an airbrush. But you just want to make sure that you gave that acrylic paint enough time to fully cure, a few days, 4 to 5 days. And just a quick note on mixed media, if anyone's interested, you can't do it the other way around. You can't paint acrylic on top of oil. The reason for that is oil paint takes a very long time to cure, usually 6 months, sometimes up to a year if some thick layers. So if you apply acrylic paint on top of oil paints, the acrylic is going to dry and cure much quicker, and that slowly drying oil paint underneath is going to make that acrylic layer start to crack. So just the other way around. Remember the rule, fat over lean. So going back to Starry Night, in my airbrush right now, I have a mixture of 50% cobalt blue with 50% Payne's gray. This is what I talked about earlier. For some of the darker shadows in here, I want a darker, more desaturated version of this blue. Ideally, I would want a color like Prussian blue, but Createx doesn't make that. I think they have an ultramarine, which is pretty dark, but I didn't have that on hand. So I just mixed up some Payne's gray with it, which is like a very dark desaturated blue. And you can see that I'm using it here for some of these shadows. I noticed in this area right here that Van Gogh added some pretty dark brush strokes here underneath that swirl. So I'm using that cobalt blue Payne's gray mixture, and you can see here that I'm just doing this freehand. As I said earlier, I started out using shields to get sharp lines for this painting, but as I continued on, I realized I could just paint these in freehand and then use my eraser to give me those sharp edges. And so you can see what I'm doing here. It's very simple, just painting in a few lines, a few strokes, parallel and next to each other. And so with this color in my airbrush, I'll go back into that swirl and just darken up a few of these lines. I'll do some of this freehand and I'll use a shield for some areas that I want to be sharper. But I want to be careful with this color because it's a pretty desaturated blue and I don't want to glaze it over the blue that I have down right now. If I add too much of this, it could start graying out the image, and I don't want to do that because the original painting is a pretty high saturated color. And so what I did here was I cleaned that color out of my airbrush and then I went straight back to cobalt blue right out of the bottle. And I'm using that here just to glaze over the areas, get in some of the midtones. And then for the brush strokes underneath this area, I'll just use that cobalt blue, apply more where I want some darker lines. And then just like before, right back over to the eraser. I'm using one here called the Mars Razor by Staedtler. It's an aggressive ink eraser and it does a very good job of cutting through the paint. To get in the rest of this swirl, I'm going to glaze some of this transparent cobalt blue into the right side of it. And then from here, I'll go right back over to that very aggressive sand eraser and start erasing out a few lines into the area, making it look like brush strokes. As I continue on, it's the same techniques over and over again. It's adding paint down, erasing into it for highlights, and then glazing some more on top. There's no secrets to the techniques I'm using here, and it's not that difficult to do, but the thing, like I said earlier, is that this one was very time consuming. There's just so many brush strokes and different curves, again, that fluid motion, that you really have to follow from Vincent's original painting. And when you copy a painting you love, even one that I must have seen at least 100 times in my life in person, you're always going to learn something new about it. One of the big things that I picked up while copying this was how Van Gogh painted this sky almost like it was a river. Every single brush stroke flows seamlessly from one to the next, and the gradients are actually quite subtle for his technique. And if you look at some of these brush strokes up close, you'll see all the nuances. It's just so many small little colors that he used to build up for the final painting. Just a bunch of shifts in hue and color temperature that are just so incredibly subtle. And this was a big part of the Impressionists in Paris during that time, which I know were an influence on him because he was friends with a few of them. And of course with his correspondence and loving relationship with his brother, who was an art dealer of Impressionist artwork within Paris. I'll probably talk about that a little bit more in next week's video where we're going to be finishing this one up. But mainly in that second part, I'll just be talking about the techniques that I used to paint this one. So if you're interested in that, make sure you check it out next Friday. That's where I'm going to wrap up the first part of this. I do hope you enjoyed it, maybe picked up a thing or two about Vincent van Gogh. Really just a phenomenal artist, one that if you're not familiar with, make sure you check out some of his work. I bet you're going to find at least one painting in there that you're going to absolutely love. Before I go, I want to say thank you so much for the generous support of the channel members who really help keep this channel going, so thank you all so much. I'd like to welcome Theo at a very generous tier 3, and I'd also like to welcome Sherry. Thank you both so much for joining and welcome. I'd also like to thank Sharkin and Just Unique for resubscribing with Unique at a generous tier 3. Really nice of you again, so thank you. So that's going to be it. I hope all of you have a great week. I hope you're well, and I wish you nothing but the best in your painting. So I'll see you back here next Friday.